Hi, this is Brian Birdwell, and welcome to an introduction to idioms. Now, an idiom is just a phrase that has a meaning beyond the sort of discernible meaning of the individual words. So, in other words, it's raining cats and dogs. This is an example of an idiom. It has nothing to do with either cats or dogs. It's just a colorful way of describing how big the raindrops are or how much rain is falling. Now, the thing about idioms on the GRE is that they are unlikely to be this colorful or poetic. There are a host of idioms that are just idiomatic expressions that lend meaning to particular sentences. So, with idioms, you're most likely to encounter them on the GRE in complex text completion problems and on reading comprehension passages. So, a thorough knowledge of idioms, especially if you are a non native English speaker, is very important for success on this test. It's important to know that on the text completion and sentence equivalence parts of the test, that if you don't know an idiom, oftentimes you'll end up choosing an answer that's the opposite of what you really want. And on reading comprehension, it can just lead you to continuously misunderstand sentences. And as that misunderstanding compounds, you just have a poor overall performance. What I'd like to do here is just give you an example of a very highly idiomatic sentence. And you can go through the whole text completion process here of trying to identify pivots and a good fill-in, etc. Feel free to do that. And what I'd really like you to focus on at the same time is how many idioms are present in this sentence and what do they actually mean. So let me give you 1 minute to work with this. Now, the first thing that you probably notice is that this sentence is quite difficult to read. A bunch of idioms in any sentence, especially several in a row, can really make the meaning hard to discern. So it's very important when you know you're looking at a sentence with lots of idioms to just slow down, take it part by part, piece by piece, and understand what you can. Here, the very first word is a common idiom, hardly a debased example. And when we say hardly in this sense, what we mean is it's not. Hardly means not or barely sometimes, most of the time not. So if I say hardly a basketball star, okay, so he's not a basketball star. Hardly a debased example means that this is not a debased example. Debased is not really an idiom, but it is a great word to know, which basically means bad. So it's not a bad example of the form. Okay, not a bad example of the form. The work, and here work is kind of an idiomatic usage of the word work, intended to mean a piece of art, or here a piece of poetry. We can often, works of art is a common idiom in English. The piece of work is in fact something of beat poetry, which for all its idiosyncrasy, and idiosyncrasy is an interesting word, which just kind of means its oddness, its odd characteristics, its unexpectedness, has gained canonicity. And canonicity is like the canon, not a canon that pirates use to sink other ships, but the literary canon, or canon with a capital C. like the accepted books of the Bible, the canon, or the accepted books of any religious tradition. And here they're not even talking about religious tradition, of course. They're just talking about the American literary tradition. So, in this sense, the canon is just the body of officially accepted or acknowledged work. So, this is not a bad example of the form. This piece of art, for all its idiosyncrasy, has gained official acceptance in the development of the American literary voice. So this would really help us come up with a good fill-in here, just interpreting these idioms. So if it's not a bad example, then actually a natural fill-in for this might be, oh, by the way, did you catch for all is also a really great idiom here. And for all, I think we've looked at once already in the course so far. It just means despite. So, despite its idiosyncrasy, it has gained official acceptance. It's not a bad example, it's actually gained official acceptance. So, we could say something here interesting with our fill ins. We could say canonical if we wanted to sort of recycle. It's not a debased example. In fact, it's canonical, gaining canonicity. So that's a great way to recycle that word. We could also say exemplary and recycle the word example. So it's not a bad example. Well, that means it's a good example. How do you say good example as an adjective? Exemplary. So either one of these fill-ins would work really great here. And when we get to our process of elimination, of course, atypical might have seemed correct if we had not interpreted all of these idioms. It would seem that it's idiosyncrasy and it's not a typical example of the American literary voice. Therefore, it is atypical, but that's not what we want to say. We want to say it is, in fact, an example of beat poetry. It's not a bad example, it's a good example of beat poetry. So that doesn't make it atypical in this sense. Critical is too particular for the meaning here. Paradigmatic, now we're getting there, and in fact, this is our correct answer. It is indicative of the very paradigm of beat poetry. Imitative is really close. This is in the ballpark, but ultimately incorrect because it doesn't imitate beat poetry. It is beat poetry. It is canonical or canonical in beat poetry. And equivocal, which you guys well know by now, is far from correct. So this is sometimes the work that's to be done in a difficult text completion problem. It can be less about the fill-in in the beginning and more about interpreting, defining, working with these idioms to understand the flow. Because idioms are often pivots in and of themselves, such as hardly or for all. So these are great pivot words that have an idiomatic connotation. And now, in what may seem to be a worst nightmare kind of situation, we're going to take that highly idiomatic sentence, put it in a reading comp passage, and ask you a question about that. So let me give you 2 minutes to work with this passage and this reading comp question. All right, so first things first, we have to read the passage and understand it. And of course, this passage begins with a pivot, an idiom of sorts, while Ginsberg's earlier poems made use of short, simple sentences, comma, Hal does not make use of short, simple sentences, is what we can infer. In fact, Hal was written in breath lengths, and then they define breath lengths for us. Breath lengths are long, rambling, even hallucinatory sentences intended to reflect spontaneity in the writing process. Great, okay? So his earlier poems were short and simple. Hal is long and rambling and intended to reflect spontaneity. Hardly a debased example of the form, and now the sentence that we're already familiar with. This is not a bad example of the form. In fact, this is paradigmatic of beat poetry, which has gained canonicity in the development of the American literary voice. So this has all become accepted now. Howl is not a bad example of the form. It's paradigmatic of the form beat poetry. So, which of the following can we infer from the passage? Let's take a look at answer choice A. Ginsberg's earlier poems have not gained canonicity in the development of American literary voice. Now, what we know is that beat poetry has gained canonicity in the development of the American literary voice. And what we know about Ginsberg's early poems is that they are short and simple. Therefore, we cannot, in fact, infer answer choice A. We don't know whether this is true or not. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. With answer choice B, since Ginsberg, the American literary voice has consistently reflected a spontaneous style. This is the kind of answer choice we might call laughably out of scope. We have not discussed the American literary voice and what its characteristics are at all in this passage. The only thing we've said is that beat poetry has gained acceptance in that voice. With answer choice C, some works in American literary canon assume a style indicative of an unpremeditated method of writing. Now, lest we be thrown off by the sort of awkward language here, let's break this up piece by piece and see what we can learn. Some works in the American literary canon. Now, what works do we know of that are in the American literary canon? Well, we know that Ginsberg's Howl is, and that some beat poetry is. Okay, that's pretty much it. So the question is, are some of them indicative of unpremeditated method of writing? And we might say, well, here's the thing. I know that Howl is paradigmatic of beat poetry, and I know that beat poetry is in the American literary canon. And I know that it is intended to reflect spontaneity. And I know that spontaneous and unpremeditated pretty much mean the same thing. So this choice sounds weird. It sounds kind of strange, but I'm going to have to leave it for the moment. I can't quite eliminate it. With answer choice D, poetry written in breath lengths is characteristic of a debased example of beat poetry, and we know this is absolutely not true, that it is hardly a debased example. It is not a debased example. And finally, Ginsberg's earlier work is not idiosyncratic, and the question is it or isn't it? Well, what do we know about Ginsberg's early work? We know that it was short and simple. Was it idiosyncratic? We don't know. Therefore, this cannot be inferred either, and our answer must be C. Now, if we look closely, of course, notice that this is entirely provable, that we know that some works in the American literary canon, we know that Howl is one of those works, and that it is indicative of an unpremeditated style of writing. Which is exactly what Howl was intended to do, was reflect spontaneity. The one teeny tiny issue here we have is some works is plural, Howl is singular. So we know that one work for sure is indicative of an unpremeditated method of writing. This is the best choice we have. C with confidence and move on. Now, if your mind was totally blown by all this, remember that we're going to talk about reading comprehension in detail beginning next week. So, for one last exercise today, what I'd like you to do is take 2 minutes to decode and identify the idioms in these 7 sentences. Ready and begin. All right, let's have a look. In number one, the first identifiable idiom is far from a given. And what far from a given means in this instance is that it's definitely not the case. So, far from a given means this software is not going to be compatible with legacy systems. It's highly unlikely that this software will be compatible. And number two, putting quotes around something is an idiomatic form, saying the French earns fetch a high price at American flea markets. Now, fetch is really just an interesting verb, fetch a high price, somewhat idiomatic. The real idiom there is just putting things in quotes means they are not that way. So these earns are actually not French, is what this is intended to communicate. With number three, the board was at loggerheads. Now, in addition to being a really interesting and large sea turtle, loggerheads in its idiomatic expression means that we're at a stopping point, we're at a dead end, we're all jammed together, we're not going anywhere, can't make any progress. So the board is unable to make progress. Why? Some made attempts to whitewash or paper over. These are both idioms for expressing covering up or glossing over, basically, the debacle, while others voted to cut bait entirely. Cut bait is an idiom from fishing. When you get your line snagged on something in the lake or the ocean, or the fish is too strong for you to reel in, you have to cut your line. In other words, cut your bait. Give up is what that means, and move on, which is a great strategy when taking the GRE, especially on quantitative questions that may be taking too much of your time. You're writing furiously equations all over your scratch paper, and you need to know when to cut bait and move on. With number four, though a middle manager by title, she was effectively made CEO by her boss's illness. Now, effectively made CEO means she is acting as the CEO, but this is not actually her title. So she is the CEO for all intents and purposes in this situation, even though that's not her actual title. With number five, Skinner and Huxley address the issue in didactic and literary styles respectively. Respectively is the idiom here that we want to point out, which just means that they go in order. Skinner was didactic and Huxley was literary. Again, we encounter quotation marks here, meaning with the former's quote-unquote novel, meaning that Skinner was so didactic that it wasn't actually a novel. It was really more of a philosophical dialogue. With number 6, seemingly here, and we've seen seemly, we've seen unseemly, and this is seemingly, which is different. So it's apparently the word seem gives us several things to think about on the GRE. Seemingly basically means that this is not the case. So seemingly, she was seemingly nice means that she's not nice at all. Bonobos live in seemingly cooperative societies means that their societies are not actually cooperative. They just appear that way. And with number 7, as pleasing as the sudden rise in profits is, comma, what would you expect to go in this blank? Something is all but assured. In this construction, as something else is, as pleasing as it is, as profitable as it is, etc. Here, as pleasing as the profits, as the rise in profits is, the opposite is about to happen. So as much fun as you're having at the party, Jimmy, I have to take you home now. Something new, some bad news is coming. So as pleasing as this is, we're going to lose all our profits. So as pleasing as it is to make profits, you might fill in the word something like bankruptcy is all but assured. This construction indicates that the opposite will follow the comma. So that's just a brief exposure to a few idioms. Remember that Chapter 5 in the strategy guide, you're going to find a whole alphabetized list of these things. You can make flashcards with idioms just like you can with normal vocabulary words. We discussed that briefly in session 1. If you are a native English speaker, you should read through the list of idioms and just note any that are surprising or unfamiliar. If you are a non-native English speaker, you should really study this idioms list hard. It's going to make your reading comprehension life much easier. Of course, another way to improve with idioms is just to read a lot, especially from GRE appropriate sources, which are sort of pseudo-academic, philosophical, the arts, culture, etc. And I've got a list of those on the slide to follow. Keeping a reading journal can be a great idea, just unusual sentence structures or captivating idioms. If you're just new idioms that you enjoy or that you would like to use, write them down, make a flashcard, and then try to use it a few times with your friends the next week. All of this, of course, is repeated and recommended in the strategy guides. Here is a list of a few GRE appropriate sources for reading. You can access them both in their paper form at the library, for example, or just go to the website and read some of the blog posts and articles there. Good luck, and I'll see you again for session 5.